Okay, great. So what are the fundamental takeaways for labor supply? Well, first of all, that people's supply of labor depends on their preferences for leisure and consumption, so that the very last hour of leisure that someone takes has to have a value to them equal to W. And also that while an individual's labor supply curve is likely to be backward bending, in other words, we can't really conclude that a person's going to work more consistently when we increase their wages, we do expect to see that in the economy as a whole, the number of hours of labor supplied is going to increase as we increase wages. Great. So let's shift focus to the other side of the labor market, right? The labor demanders. Now, as we talked about in Unit 2, labor demand is a consequence of demand for output. In other words, the demanders for labor are firms. Firms' objective is to make as much money as possible. So the reason that firms are hiring workers in the first place is in order to produce output that generates revenue. Cool. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take what we've done that in thinking about firms' problems, right, thinking about firms' optimal output, which gave us labor demand, and deconstruct it a little bit to understand labor demand a little bit better. So let's start by thinking about a perfectly competitive firm, right, a firm in a perfectly competitive market where prices and wages are given. Let's say that we're going to think about manicurists, right, a firm providing manicures. And in order to produce manicures, I need labor and capital. Right? Using some sort of a production function like this. Right? So I need workers, I need, let's say, those comfy chairs that you sit in when you get a manicure. Wonderful. So how is this firm going to decide how many workers to hire? As we've talked about, right, what they're going to do is essentially decide what the cheapest way is to produce manicures given labor and capital, decide how much output to produce, and then from there we can conclude how many workers they ended up hiring. Right? In other words, what the firm's going to do is they're first going to find their MRTS, right? So we'll say cheapest way of making manicures. Right? They're going to find their MRTS, MPL over MPK equal to W over R, right, if we can assume an interior solution. And Q equals F of LK. Together, those are going to lead them to an L of Q, right, the number of workers they'll hire to make Q units of output, and a K of Q, right? They'll say that their cost function is going to be W times L of Q plus R times K of Q, right? And then they'll produce output where marginal cost equals the price. Right? And then they'll say their labor demand is going to be L of Q star. Right? This is essentially what we've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think through this problem from a slightly different perspective. Think about what we can conclude about the number of workers a firm's going to hire. If we're not fundamentally interested in the amount of output they're producing, we're fundamentally interested in their demand for labor. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to deconstruct our marginal cost in the same way that we did when we thought about output efficiency. Right? So I'm going to say my marginal cost is really equal to dC dQ, right? Which is going to equal the derivative with respect to Q of W times L of Q plus R times K of Q. Yeah? Now what we said is, it's actually not going to matter whether I change L or change K on the margin. And the reason for that is exactly because we know MPL over MPK equals W over R. right? As a result, we know that W over the marginal product of labor equals R over the marginal product of capital, right? So as a result, I can say that my marginal cost of Q is going to equal W times the L of Q dQ, right? In other words, my marginal cost is the cost of the change in work, the increased workers that I need to hire to produce output times the amount each worker costs. And this is, as I was saying before, exactly equal to R times D K of Q dQ, which is going to be equal to W over the marginal product of labor. Right? Why is this? Because the marginal product of labor is equal to dQ dL. Right? Which is 1 over dL dQ. Great. So this means my marginal cost is W over MPL. So when I produce my optimal output, right, I say price equals marginal cost of Q. This is going to tell me that price equals W over my marginal product of labor. So if I rearrange this a little bit, I'll say that price times the marginal product of labor is going to equal W when I'm hiring my optimal number of workers to produce my optimal amount of output. So let's think about what this is telling us. What this is telling us is, if I want to decide how many workers to hire, what I'll do is I'll hire workers up until the amount of output each worker produces times the value of that output equals the cost of that worker to me. Right? In other words, the dollars generated by this worker, right, output times dollars per unit, equals the wage of the worker. Right? Dollars per unit times units per worker equals dollars per worker. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Another way that I can write this, and something I'll be using, is to call, just as shorthand, price times marginal product of labor. I'll redefine this as marginal revenue product, which is really just to say the dollars generated by each worker. And so then I'll say my optimal level of labor is going to be where W equals the marginal revenue product as a function of the number of workers. Great. So graphically, right, just to be clear about what we're saying, about the number of workers graphed against dollars, we expect to see our marginal revenue product of labor, which is going to equal P times the marginal product of labor. We're going to expect this to be downward sloping. And why is that? Because we expect that for firms in competitive markets, right, who must have diminishing economies of scale when they're producing, right, marginal costs have to be increasing, we expect that the marginal product of labor has to be decreasing, right? They've got to have diminishing marginal returns to labor. On the other hand, if they're facing a constant wage rate, right, they can hire as many workers as they want at a given wage W, right? Then they're going to have a cost per worker that looks like this, right? Revenue per worker is downward sloping, cost per worker is constant. So how many workers should they hire? They should hire every single worker that is bringing in more than they cost, right? Up until the point where W equals MPL. Each worker is bringing in more revenue than it costs in wages. If they hired any additional workers, the worker would cost more to them than they were bringing in revenue. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay. So last thing I want to do with this is just go through an example of how we're going to calculate our marginal revenue product, and then we'll be set. So let's say I'm a firm that has a production function, just in terms of L, like F of L equals, let's say 4 times L to the 1/2. Right, and I want to know my optimal number of workers. So what I would do, right, using the direct approach, is I would say my marginal product of labor is going to be the FDL, which is going to be 2 over L to the 1/2, right? So my marginal revenue product would equal the price times 2 over L to the 1/2, right? Optimal L star is going to be repeat times 2 over L to the 1/2 equals del E. That means that my number of workers hired is going to be 2P over W, right? I'll have L squared equals 2P over W, so L is going to equal 2P over W squared. Great. Oh, I'm so sorry. L is going to equal, yeah, no, this is good. Right, L is going to equal 2P over W all squared, or if you prefer, 4 times P over W squared. So what this is going to tell us, something I just want to mention here, is that as the wages increase, right, firms are going to hire fewer workers, in this case exclusively because their optimal output is going to decrease, although you'll note we never had to find our optimal output here. As the price of output increases, the number of workers demanded is going to increase, right, our labor demand is going to increase. So an important consequence of this, if we're thinking about what determines somebody's wages, right, what determines the wages in an occupation, there's really 2 pieces of it. The first is that the more productive workers are, right, the higher their marginal product, the more output they can produce, the higher their wages are going to be, right? The more workers we're going to hire at a given wage. But also the more valuable the output is that they're going to produce, the more workers we're going to hire. So we can expect to see demand for certain types of labor increasing, either because new technology makes that labor more productive, or just because consumers of the product that you're producing end up liking the product more, right? So even if workers don't change at all, worker productivity, production processes don't change at all, we might expect to see some types of workers become more valuable, right? So something like, let's say, being a exercise fitness instructor, right, a Zumba dance instructor, you're probably not seeing massive increases in productivity over time, right? There's only so peppy a person can be. But if we see that demand for Zumba dance classes increases over time, we might expect the wages in that occupation to rise as well. Okay, perfect.